Welcome to another membership event from Freedom of the Press Foundation. My name is Ryan Rice. I'm the membership coordinator. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar is called A Training of Trainers. It's a follow-up from a Digital Security 101 training we had earlier that is available in the archives. You're free to view that at any time. This session will have a Q&A option, as well as it will be recorded for viewing later. So if you have questions at any time during or after the event, feel free to submit them that way or via email. I'd like to thank my colleagues for taking the time to do this training for us today. I have sat in on some Digital Security 101s, but never this one. So I'm excited to sit with you all and learn. So without further ado, I will kick it over to the Digital Security team. Thanks, guys.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Training of Trainers event. My name is Harlow. I'm our Director of Digital Security, and we've got a lot of stuff to cover today. Let's start with our introductions and our screen share. Go ahead, Olivia.
All right, awesome. My name is Olivia Martin, and I am our Deputy Director of Digital Security at Freedom of the Press Foundation. I'll be running the screen share, so I will get that going while I pass the mic over to my colleague, David.
Hello, this is David Huerta, Digital Security Trainer over at Freedom of the Press Foundation.
Hello, and it's me, Martin Shelton, Principal Researcher, also on the training team.
Sweet. Okay, and as we're getting this going into the optimal mode, let's talk about what we are going to be doing today in training you to become digital security champions. So we definitely can't say that we're going to give you everything that you need to go out and start teaching digital security. I think we can all say it takes like a good amount of time to kind of like get your bearings in how these types of things work. There's a lot of dynamics, but we will teach you the concepts that we think are very important for digital security trainers to know and to understand more deeply so they can guide people. And also we're going to talk about the techniques that we've developed in-house in order to make us as efficient of a team in doing trainings as possible. All right. Olivia, do you want to take this part?
Sure. So just a couple of ground rules. As with all FPF hosted events, we will ask participants and facilitators to follow our code of conduct. So this is not an exhaustive list, but we do ask everyone to be friendly and patient, assume good faith and good intentions, and be careful in the words that you choose in being respectful to this very important community. So if you'd like more information or do want to reach out about something regarding the code of conduct specifically, or something that you see or experience during this session, you can find all those details on our code of conduct page at freedom.press/about/code-conduct. So perhaps, Ryan, if you could chuck that in the chat at some point, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, we will keep this slide up for one more second.
And feel free to use our Q&A tool here in order to ask us questions. We'll try to get to those things at different parts during this particular workshop, and also perhaps chime in into the chat just to help you out there when other people are speaking. And without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to teach you about the training cycle. This is a 5-pointed, set of tasks that we always do when we're doing a large engagement, a small engagement. It really doesn't matter the size. We're always thinking about these 5 things. So we have need finding, planning, delivering, implementation, and feedback. And we're going to go into those in great detail. The first bit that we're going to discuss is the part that incorporates need finding and planning. These are the most important parts of a particular training. So let's go into that a little bit in more depth, starting with need finding.
All right, and so need finding can look a couple of different ways. And most notably, what we're trying to accomplish during a need finding during the need finding stage is better understanding what the community or the individual that we're working with is in need of in terms of, what are their goals for the training, what data they want to protect, and sort of what are the threats to that data itself. Because each and every one of us in this call, if you're watching later on, probably has different answers to those questions, right? So one of the ways that we that we accomplish these goals during the need finding stage is to perform what's called a risk assessment, sometimes referred to as doing threat modeling. It can look a bunch of different ways. This is just one of the methods that we use to identify the sort of risks that a particular person is concerned about with regard to their data, and sort of what the threats to that they might experience when trying to protect that data itself. So I'll kind of gloss over these really quickly, but what we're trying to do is identify what assets people have. That's our data at hand. So this could be living on our mobile devices, on our laptops, on our desktops at the office, for example, or in cloud services that we use on a daily basis. From whom are we trying to protect those assets? These are what we call our adversaries in this particular model. And when we're trying to think about, what are the tactics that I might be coming up against in trying to protect these assets from these adversaries, we want to identify what resources they have. Are they technically skilled, or are they going to rely on more socially based attacks? What level of financial resources do they have, or, legal jurisdiction? And then I do want to take a bit of time to talk about likelihood here, which is the next component of our risk assessment. So, how likely is it that my adversary is going to target me? Especially as we train many journalists, likelihood is something that changes over time based off of maybe their profile in the industry, the types of beats that they are working with, the level of sensitivity of the particular investigation that they're working on, as well as all these other factors that are kind of outside of our control, political factors, environmental ones. So likelihood is a really fluid concept, and really kind of brings home the point that our risk assessment is one that changes all the time, one that we need to check in with throughout the course of an investigation, for example. And then when we get to our final question about our own personal ability, that's when we're asking, what are the resources that I have to defend against these tactics that my adversary might use? How much time do I have to sit and listen to this group of digital security trainers teach me new technical skills? And, based off of that, how can I prioritize my needs? So, whenever we are doing the need finding component of an engagement, the likelihood part is sometimes the most tricky. We're going to talk more about that as we go through the rest of the session today.
Something to add on likelihood is that a lot of things come into the equation when it comes down to this. Every sort of like country, every single sort of even state, or even like reservation, like all these different geopolitical jurisdictions that exist where there are journalists have different concerns, and they have different risks. Things like data brokers, for example, which we talk about in doxing prevention training, are less of an issue in some countries as they are in the United States, for example. Same thing with SIM jacking attacks. That's something that is, a common, normal, everyday thing that happens a lot in some countries. Other countries almost doesn't happen. So that's something to keep in mind as basically know your audience is sort of step one to a lot of this.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You have to know your audience before you go into a training because digital security advice is not always universal. And I'll talk about two perspectives about that. So first off, as far as region or regionality is concerned, you might be working with a group whose adversary is going to use what are called backdoor tactics, meaning that, you know, if you think about like how a house has a front door and a back door, if an attacker goes in through the back door of, you know, a particular safe space or a space that we want to protect, what that means is that they are most likely living in a jurisdiction where lawful actors such as hackers can act without any kind of with impunity, without any recourse. They just kind of do what they want, and they take access to people's assets via tools like hacking, social engineering, phishing, and things like that. And also it comes with oftentimes the added threat of physical violence or other types of retaliation affecting people's, you know, like families and livelihoods as they go after the data that they're seeking. So this is like the lawless adversary that works within a certain set of tools. But then on the other side, we have front door using adversaries who are typically, although it can go either way, but typically we associate that with people who work within rule of law jurisdictions where they have tools such as subpoenas and warrants and, you know, like court orders of a variety of kinds. They have to go through a lot of bureaucracy in order to get that, approval for a judge in order to issue some request for information from a platform like Facebook or Twitter or things like that. That actually changes the type of security advice that you're going to pack into a particular training, because not all tools are, or not all threats are universally solved by applying the same type of tools across the board. So just to give an example of further about what a front door tactic looks like, this is a picture of what was once Facebook's law portal for requests for metadata, or to actually like file, you know, a certain type of reports for requests for user data. This is a front door tactic, and if you're coming from within a jurisdiction where you know, you have the possibility of getting that request for information signed off upon, Facebook can give you tools that will alleviate a lot of friction in getting the data that you need in terms of the criminal investigation. So that's not what you see from the back door. And this is something that is like, or an example of a tool that a lot of these platforms, as big as Facebook, but even smaller, you know, as far as like your common email provider, do have available to them. So we always kind of keep these tensions in mind and have to be prepared in order to help people mitigate the threats on either side of this particular threat surface. Yeah. And so finally, to bring that home about how not all digital security advice is universal, and you have to be mindful of that in creating a training, this is a slide that I love to bring up, which is from The Intercept, two different articles on The Intercept, where on one hand, on our left side, we have, you know, really excellent advice about how to properly lock down Signal, get your friends to use it, you know, in order to protect certain types of communications. And there's a certain type of training where this corresponds exactly to the advice that you'd hear from us. We want you to use Signal, and we'll get into that why, but you probably already know why. But we want people to use Signal if, you know, they're organizing in, you know, the United States or in other countries in the West. However, we can contrast this with another article that from that same paper where a group of activists were definitely overly scrutinized simply because they had used Signal, because it comes from a context both politically and culturally where that did not fit their threat model, even though we know technically it's the best tool to use. So once again, this is what we have to contend with. But without further ado, we are very quickly going to go through what we think are the 5 concepts that any successful trainer should have and deep knowledge of, and be prepared to ask questions from, or answer questions rather, from the people that you're training in order to be effective. We're going to speed through this because these are already things that you probably have already encountered in other trainings of ours or with others. And also we have an excellent growing number of YouTube videos with these concepts in more depth that you as members have access to. Go ahead, Martin. Let's talk about encryption.
Yeah. So the first one that we want to go over is just how encryption works. We often will talk about some of the different types of tools that you can use in order to address some of these confidentiality or privacy concerns that you might have with some of your data. And this gets into questions around, say, for example, encryption in transit. We are talking about the different types of ways in which we connect to websites, that we use apps, and that in the course of doing that, you're going to want to talk to folks about how they can encrypt the connection to all of these different places and applications that they're accessing. This is where we get into terms like HTTP versus HTTPS. This is connection encryption over the web. And similarly, SSL, TLS, same thing. And we often like to also kind of visualize this breaking out the complexity as it continues to build when you start to add concepts like encryption on top of thinking about the concept of just connecting to a website. So next slide. Say, for example, you might imagine connecting to Google or some other website as a direct course, but in practice, there's a lot of intermediaries that might include things like whoever is controlling the Wi-Fi that you're using. It could also be the internet service provider. And so now we're talking about a little network. If you are visiting a website over an unencrypted connection, then anything that you're sending along the way is going to be unencrypted, and that all those intermediaries also get a copy of it. So then this is why we also like to talk about things like HTTPS and the value of that. Luckily, nowadays, most of the websites that you connect to, next slide, are going to be HTTPS encrypted. So less of a concern than it was just a few years ago, but still something that we think is really foundational for trying to communicate. Here's what we need to know about connection security on the web. Next slide. Now, this also gets into issues around the fact that when you connect to a given website, well, that website is still able to see all the stuff that you're doing there. So you're sending Twitter DMs, for example, or this is also true with telecommunications networks. The telecommunication provider, maybe it's Sprint or Verizon, whoever it might be, they also have access to copies of the stuff that you're sending along the way. You're encrypting your connection to that provider. They encrypt to the person who you're texting or who you're messaging. So we always try to make sure to front load a lot of these conversations with just an understanding that most service providers are going to have access to the things that you're sending. And this is why we really like end-to-end encryption. So we often will also get into some of the ways to work within these systems by using tools that will allow you to secure your connection in such a way that only the people in conversation, you and your conversational participants, are able to decrypt that message. So even the service provider can't get it. And this is when we get into concepts like public and private keys. These are concepts for communicating connection encryption over the web. GPG is another example of this. This helps you to do things like encrypting a blob of text or, say, an email. And then there's applications like Signal and WhatsApp that are end-to-end encrypted by default. So to extend this, our little graph here, we can think of this as all of the intermediaries being cut out of the conversation. Oh, so we also like to use this fun little matrix to compare and contrast some of the different tools that are out there. And this will change based on engagement to engagement. Sometimes we'll have some groups that are really excited about things like Telegram. In the US context, that doesn't happen quite as much, but so we try to play it by ear. What is the group that we're interested in working with? How do they want to operate? But you can compare something like Signal to WhatsApp, and then if we want to explode all of the different applications here, then you can compare them. And we like to talk through some of the different properties of each of these applications based on things like whether or not they include end-to-end encryption, and how they treat things like contact lists that the participants or all of the users might be uploading to that to the servers for that given service. Next slide. And this also gets into a question around what kind of metadata is being produced by the given service. Metadata is just a fun word for data about your data. So we are talking about things like information about the conversation that could be like who's having that conversation, when did they send a given message, how frequently they're sending messages. In this case, we can actually see an encrypted blob that's being sent back and forth by two users. And at the beginning of each of these blobs, you see a few letters there. You see OTR, off the record. This is a protocol, so that's also metadata. This is telling any observer, okay, I can still see, even if I can't read the message, I can still see who's talking, I can see when they're talking, and I can determine how they're speaking. So this is still really useful information, and some services are better than others at hiding this kind of information from a potential onlooker.
And as Martin has, really adeptly and succinctly described, is how we like to think about protecting data as it travels, in transit between, our devices and, let's say, a website that we're trying to connect to, or end to end between, our device and another person that we're communicating with over an end-to-end encrypted communications platform. But what about the data that sits on our devices? All the documents that I have, the transcripts that I'm transcribing and storing on my desktop on my work machine. When we're thinking about protecting that data, this is when we look at the properties of encryption at rest. So we do a lot of work with, journalists, and also, kind of related fields such as documentary filmmakers. And so you can imagine that filmmakers are storing a lot of data on, external storage devices or, on their desktops. And these are groups that are consistently asking us, like, how do I protect my data while it's at rest on these external storage devices, like, USB drives or hard drives. And so this is when we, start to talk to the folks that we're training about concepts like full disk encryption, AES 256, File Vault, BitLocker, and Veracrypt. The latter three being software that we use to encrypt data at rest. So let's talk a bit more and sort of elaborate on some of these terms. So when we're thinking about protecting the data that rests on our hard drives on our computers, for example, this is when we are talking about what's called full disk encryption. So what this does is it's a utility that's available once you enable it. All of the data that sits on your hard drive in your on your computer is scrambled and encrypted when you power down your device. So when we're talking to journalists and filmmakers, we say this is an essential for, let's say, when you're going when you're bringing your device across a border, and you're concerned about, the risk of confiscation of this device, and you have data on it that you want to protect. Full disk encryption is what's going to protect that data on your computer. So for Mac devices, this is when we talk to folks about enabling full disk encryption through File Vault. And then Windows users have access to BitLocker to enable full disk encryption, with some caveats. If you want to know more, reach out to us. We're happy to talk. And so, in addition to the data that's on our devices, we're also talking about using software to encrypt the data that's on our USBs, our external hard drives, as I was mentioning in some of those sort of cases earlier on. So for Mac users, we use a tool called Disk Utility to encrypt our external storage devices, like those hard drives and those USBs. So again, talking about how filmmakers might protect, archives of their footage. This is when we want to teach them a lot more about how to use tools like Disk Utility for Mac users and Veracrypt for, cross-platform teams or, Windows and Linux specific teams. So we have a lot of these resources available on another platform that that we've written the content for on digitalsecurity.film. So any filmmakers in the room who want to learn more about Disk Utility and Veracrypt applications, go ahead and check out this link that's on the bottom of our slide here. So we also have media makers who are on the go, who are, mobile first. There are different ways and different strategies that we might talk to them about how to encrypt, notes that they might take on their mobile device. So this is just a reminder that, especially as a trainer, it's your duty to really understand, what are the needs of the community that I'm working with? What are the devices that are at play? And, how mobile do we need to be? That's really going to determine the types of tools that you introduce when talking about encrypting data at rest.
Okay, and yep, you got to know how to do it like inside and out, actually. But we are now at the most fundamental of, I think, any of the principles that we teach. So we can just zoom through that. David?
Thanks, Arlo. Just to kind of like put a bow on that last section, something new reiterate is everybody that will come to a training like this is being told by every single product and app that they use encryption. So it is important to disambiguate, what that means. Every single journalist has been told, well, I use this thing, it says secure. It says encrypted, it has those words in them. But being able to sort of explain how, encryption can mean different things. It can mean at rest, it can mean end-to-end encrypted, it can mean encrypted in transit, is super important. That being said, though, what's really important, though, is considering the risks that are probably the most ubiquitous and some of the ways that people can address those. So in this case, thinking about credentials and online accounts. This is something that basically boils down to managing secure passwords. And, there's a lot of reasons why we bring this up. But if you look at any kind of like lawless actors that would need to get into your account via, say, a phishing attack, for example, or via trying a password that you've used in the past, that's a really popular way breaches happen. If you look at the Verizon DBIR report, which is sort of published by the cybersecurity industry to show like what enables cyber attacks to even happen, what happens when people get breached. It's usually that. It's usually an adversary gets a hold of a password, uses it to log in, and then causes a mess. So that's why we talk about passwords. And one thing to think about is passwords and the rules for them in the past maybe made a lot of sense. Nowadays, not so much. Password 123, a lot of people choose this password thinking nobody else has thought about that, or that nobody would ever guess that is their password. But people don't guess passwords, computers do. And the abilities for computers to crack passwords are significantly larger than they are for humans, and significantly larger for a computer in 2022 than it would be for one in 1997, when, you know, the rules for passwords were kind of first established and became sort of this weird crystallized tradition. So next slide, you'll kind of see what a good password looks like. You'll notice here that this is where, you know, you as a trainer will clash with the things that journalists are annoyed by when they're told by their IT team that they need to have a special character or a number or uppercase, lowercase letter, when in reality, the thing that they should be recommending is just like making the minimum length really long. This passphrase, for example, has no special characters whatsoever. It's just very long and is actually really random. Not this specific one, because this is in an XKCD comic. But you can see that Lida is like literally an exponentially stronger password because of that. And realistically, though, the thing that people can be expected to do is not, you know, remember in their brain 500 unique accounts for all the different things that they have to log into. And in a newsroom, you have a lot of things that you have to log into. So in this case, a password manager kind of helps with that. Although this seems like really basic to some of you, most people don't know what this is. I will reiterate, most journalists don't know what a password manager is. They have never heard of one. Their newsroom does not provide one. I do this poll every single time I do a training. It's like, how many of you people have, how many people have heard of passwords? How many people are being provided by a new password by their newsroom? And by and large, especially once you leave the coasts, the answer is a shrug. Like, you'll maybe get one person that has had a password provided through their newsroom, and then like maybe 2 or 3 people that have heard of what a password manager even is. There's reasons for these recommendations, but basically they work. So you can check out our guides on that. Two-factor authentication, also really important, because this is another thing that a lot of people have been exposed to now because of Google, frankly, and sort of like mandating a lot of two-factor authentication for accounts. That being said, though, it's important to recognize that most smaller newsrooms, or a mix, depending on like where you go, like a lot of newsrooms won't have like a thing like Okta or Duo set up for their company logins, for example. So in many cases, if people want two-factor authentication, they're kind of on their own for setting that up on the accounts that they use. So yeah, that's why YubiKeys are super useful. I bring them up all the time because, again, these are things that absolutely nobody has heard about outside of like us, basically. And it's important to respond to like common questions that are not necessarily security related. For example, something that came up for a long time was just like, well, how strong are these security keys? And like, well, you know, they use AES 256 encryption, they support ECC. And like, no. Like, what happens if I drop them? What happens if I leave them in the laundry? What happens if my ferret buries it in the bottom of my sofa? True story. What happens if my cat digests it? So this is like one of those things where, you know, journalists live like lives of chaos, just like many of us do as well. So things happen, keys fall off bikes and cars, and things get left on top of car roofs. So that's why this post basically exists, to showcase that actually these are very durable and probably more durable than your smartphone. So
I kind of want to flip the script, and I really, really hope you don't hate me, because I'm going to like just give away like most of my time to talk about social media privacy. Also very interesting. But David, and actually everyone, I know that like in credential security, there's always so much pushback from people that you're training, such as what you'd mentioned, like, what if I lose this YubiKey? Why should I get that? You know, like, what's wrong with my phone number? How dare you tell me to change this? I don't trust a password manager because, you know, they have all my passwords. Do you have any like trainer tips for how you address those, that skepticism?
yeah. So there's a few things there. Each tool will have its own sort of like concerns associated with it. Password managers ultimately are a sort of like put your eggs in one basket type situation. But what I think people don't realize is that they're already doing that in some way or another. If you go through any practice where you're like hands-on training journalists and they need to log into something, it's in their notes app. It's in the passwords are already in their notes app. They're already in their email, in like email drafts. They're already in like a bunch of other like random places. And in some cases, like those have more security concerns than what a password manager would include. But what I like to emphasize is, of course, you know, having talked about encryption at this point, basically emphasizing like this password vault is end-to-end encrypted. The blast pass hack is something that I always like to bring up when this concern is surfaced, because that is a situation where, you know, when you hear a breach happen, you normally expect, you know, your credentials are out there, they're, you know, you're being sold for, you know, Bitcoins or whatever. And in this case with LastPass, like they get hacked like basically every other year, and your passwords are still safe there. And the lesson for that is that's a teachable moment of basically being like, here's why your passwords were not affected, is because they're encrypted with your main passphrase.
Yeah.
And when it comes to security keys and things like that, there's not really too much of a pushback, so much as just like, why haven't I heard about this before? Because you got to understand, like most people are informed by what they see in the world and in advertising. And when it comes to cybersecurity, that basically means, you know, ads for VPNs and paid sponsors for YouTube videos for VPNs. And VPNs basically don't have anything to do with account security at all. So that's kind of the first thing they ask, because that's what they know, that's what they've heard about. But as far as like connecting the dots, those dots generally don't connect. So that's why it's important to bring up the things that actually do address their concerns.
Thoughtful answers from the trenches. Thank you. Okay, so to push us along, I'm going to start talking about social media privacy, another tenant in, you know, the trifecta of tools that you must know about very deeply. And primarily, the reason why social media hygiene is very important is because, in addition to all of the things, like all of the technical stuff, you can advance aside, that's fine. All of the technical stuff that we have been talking about and will continue to talk about, you cannot deny the great impact that targeted online harassment has had on not only like the safety, the digital safety of the journalists that we train, but also their physical safety, and also from a press freedom issue, their willingness to continue to do the excellent work that they do. There's a lot of self-censorship, and this is the first way forward. So there's a bajillion platforms out there. We always like to take a holistic view of, you know, like meeting people with the platforms and tools and workflows that they're comfortable with. But these are like the fundamentals, no matter what platform that you're looking at. So first and foremost, that two-factor authentication is known and shown to be the most effective way to protect an account. And you can do that on all of the platforms. Understanding how, when, and where to revoke old or unfamiliar sessions where you're logged in. Most of the time, this is not because someone is actively being hacked into or something like that. It's actually because that one time, you know, you logged into your mom's or your Facebook account from your mom's house or something like that, and you forgot. The point is to know exactly what to do, kind of like a fire drill. People appreciate that. And also helping people establish a baseline of what secure looks like. So in the event of something really, really traumatic, you at least have the muscle memory of having practiced these skills. Limiting visibility, because not only does that you know, contribute to online harassment, such as doxing, but it's also something that can be used in retaliation to put pressure on, let's say, your employer to get you fired by going back through the annals of your Twitter history to find something really embarrassing that can be misconstrued. Interactions such as DMs and tagging are really contentious, and it also depends on the platform, and it depends on the journalist and their beat. So for instance, a number of journalists insist on having their DMs on Twitter open, and that's because they might communicate with sources there. However, there are still a number of journalists for whom that is the worst thing to do, because it just invites nothing but abuse and harassment, and makes them scared to even pick up their phone, you know, during the day. But that said, because social media belongs to the person, it does not belong to the organization who has invited us to put together this training series. We as trainers have to walk a very, very fine line between empowering the individual to make their own decisions and giving, like, nudging them towards what we feel is, like, you know, most I guess, benefits the use of social media within that organization as a whole. So as a trainer, it's like really fine. And this is also another place where you get a lot of pushback. The other things that we say that are like absolutely non-negotiable is keeping location data out of posts. No brainer, but it does happen sometimes by default. And getting a handle on discoverability via your email address, or more importantly, your phone number, because that is where a lot of stalking might happen. Fun fact about, and you can skip, Olivia, if you would just like show the next slides, like just very briefly as I talk, because it's not about the slides, it's just about the amount of research we have to do into any of these platforms. You can go to the next one to find exactly where new settings are and lay it out in like, tip sheets that we distribute or whatever that change all the time based off of the platform. And knowing that there's so many platforms out there that we can't always catch them all. So yeah.
And I think as Harlow mentioned, we're getting more and more requests to cover some of these really frequently asked questions around social media privacy and security, especially as they relate to online harassment and doxing. And another area where we get a lot of interest and a lot of questions is like, how can I think about this like little tiny computer that I carry around with me everywhere? What are the basics that I need to know in order to, use my mobile phone for journalism or for, whatever it is that I need when I'm on the go, without sort of exposing my data to, corporations that I'm not interested in exposing that data to, or, bad actors like my adversaries in my threat model. So, one thing that really does kind of bring home mobile privacy is talking about mobile permissions or app permissions. In brief, this involves a conversation during a training about the types of assets that you have on your mobile phone, like your location data, like your microphone, and access to your camera, and thinking granularly, app by app. Do I feel comfortable, with this particular app, this flashlight app, having access to all of my contacts and let's say also my microphone and my camera? Like, that sounds either, malicious or just an extension of surveillance capitalism that I'm not comfortable with. So we like to talk through, granularly going through your app permissions on your mobile device and thinking about what you feel most comfortable with. Again, like there's no way during a training that we can offer hard and fast rules on this. But more so what we're doing is giving folks the awareness so they feel empowered to make those decisions about sharing their data. So there are different tips and tricks. We always do like to show people, dependent on the mobile operating system that they're using, where to find their app permissions and how to dial them back if they so choose. So it's always interesting to note that this isn't over explaining. Many folks don't, haven't explored this part of their settings on their mobile devices. And what they're doing is sharing what is the default app permission on a given app, which can oftentimes be intrusive. So, this is how we would walk through where to find those app permissions on iOS versus, the Android ecosystem. Which kind of approach the story of app permissions, slightly differently. Remember when I was talking about full disk encryption earlier on your desktop devices? We also, always think it's important to bring home the fact that mobile devices also, most modern mobile devices support full disk encryption. On some Android devices, it's not on by default, and it's something that you must enable as you would on your desktop devices. And so this is when we call that out And we also mentioned the fact that iOS devices, so your iPhones, are full disk encrypted by default. I could also talk for quite a while about mobile passcodes and, biometrics. This oftentimes comes up in Q&A, but we can share that during another session. So Harlow, why don't you jump in on
yeah.
Yeah.
I think that that's actually a good question, because that's another example within trainings where you do get, and it's not pushback, because pushback has a negative connotation, but you're challenged to talk through people's certain assumptions about, the security of certain devices based off of urban legends that they might have heard of, and help lead them towards choices. So like do I use face unlock or touch ID or whatever it is, whatever biometrics, that's always the somebody has the tinfoil hat on and they're like, Apple has my face, and so I'm not going to do this. And then you have to okay, that's a great place to start. I'm glad you brought that up, because inevitably someone brings it up, and bring them through the thought exercise while disabusing them of the notions, but addressing exactly what they are so worried about as far as introducing biometrics is concerned. And actually, to this point, to this slide, another place where you do have to talk people through their fears and talk them away from urban legends is, what people can do when they actually do have your phone, what your rights are. And this is once again entirely region specific, and also depends on who you're working with. So definitely, this is something that these are discussions that are more likely to come up when you're working with local journalists who actually are out there covering unrest, covering, or even just covering mundane events, but out there, and the threat to their security is not the three-letter agency, the FBI or the CIA, but it's actually local law enforcement who does not care about them, does not care about the fact that they're a journalist, and they actually have more of a civilian's profile as far as their risk is concerned. And so this is where we talk a lot about what a device like a Celebrate is capable of, which is immediately what people ask. Or on the next slide, one of the ways that we actually, or I've started to kind of help people fill out the broader picture, is to give them, just research that we've read from, trustworthy sources that actually prove that minus a Celebrate, the biggest threat to, someone with physical access to your phone is you not knowing your right as an American citizen to not answer the question, what is your password? That is actually where most of these things, where physical intercept starts, not with a Celebrate, not necessarily, although it is definitely, it has been used, but not necessarily with a cell site simulator or a Stingray and things like that. So these are all just really interesting, interventions that you have to make. But that said, no matter what you do, this is always the perfect time to bring it back to that matrix exercise and make sure that people are definitely not using text messages to do any of their organizing or any of their coordination, and definitely not talking about investigations that they've been working on over the duration of that particular project.
All right, so the last section here out of our 5 is on browser safety, and absolutely everybody has a browser that they that they've gravitated to over the years. Chances are it is Chrome, but just looking at the market research, it's usually Chrome. So we often will start with talking about Chrome and what is Chrome doing, but we also like to get into other browsers depending on what kind of group we're working with. Things to know about Chrome, we always talk about some of the security advantages. Architecturally, it's a really strong browser, probably supported at most organizations, and then it has some cool features to do things like you can make little personas and compartmentalize, say, your work versus your personal use of Chrome if you want to. But the flip side of that is it also connects with Google really nicely. Could be a feature, or it could be a disadvantage depending on how you like to use your Google services. So it pretty much links, just scoops up all the stuff that you're doing within Chrome into your Google profile if you have sync enabled. And then you can go into your Google account and find all this stuff. So next slide. So we'd like to talk about things like looking into the settings around web and app activity. And then there's other things like contacts or passwords, things that can be scooped up into your Google accounts if you are using Sync. Next slide. We also like to show folks all of the different types of controls that they have in their Google account. The Google account actually it's a funny thing, because now we're talking about the architecture of a browser that's built that also has a Google account. The Google account has a whole bunch of unrelated settings that have nothing to do with your browser. So got to talk about that as well. But sticking with the browser for a moment, you can go into the settings, next slide, and look at your web and app activity. Say, for example, you visit a particular page on Facebook, and if you have sync enabled, now that record of, it's like, here's all my browser history, is then put into your Google account. And then say, I don't know, you're tweeting something and the very same thing happens again. So you can go find all of that information, all the searches, all the things that you were tweeting about in that Google app activity. So it's something web and app activity section of their privacy settings within Google. So we always direct folks to myaccount.google.com, show them how exactly to disable any of that if they don't want it on. Firefox, we talk about some of the different perceptions and benefits of Firefox compared to Chrome. There's pretty good security, and it's kind of catching up in a lot of ways to Chrome, but there are some things that it's a little more vulnerable on. So try to kind of unpack broadly what are some of the advantages versus disadvantages of each of these browsers. The privacy controls also not quite as granular as Chrome. Now, at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, all right, this is a lot. It seems like a lot of information that you might be tasked with memorizing or communicating to folks who are unfamiliar with a lot of these concepts. And it might be that, that it's actually going to require a little bit of studying. So we can talk a little bit about some of the resources that we really like, and hopefully they're also useful to you all. For folks who might not have seen these before, here's a book that I really enjoy. Actually, I first learned about it from Olivia. This book, How the Internet Really Works. It's a very cute kind of animated volume and goes into all the nuts and bolts of how internet architecture works and encryption and different types of tools that you can build on top of the web in order to try to address your privacy. That one's a really good one. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, they have a wonderful series of resources called the Security Education Companion. And what this does is it focuses on some of the different types of techniques and also kind of strategy that you might want to bring into a training. There's also a lot of kind of information there that comes from a pedagogy specific perspective. So there's something that there's not a lot out there that's quite like this. It's very good. Then there's also PEN America. They have this field guide to online harassment. There's a lot in here also about kind of the strategy within news organizations that you don't get to see quite everywhere. A lot of the resources that are out there, they're very individually focused. So here's the thing that you can do to take care of your digital security and privacy. This one's unique in that it really focuses on not only some of those issues, but also getting into questions around policies. What exactly are the procedures that would be helpful to a media organization to begin to address some of their harassment woes? Yeah.
Okay, so now let's get into how, after all of that, how we actually package that up. We have a variety of different like pedagogical tactics that we are all equally fond of. Some of us more than others, some of us have our own style, and it also depends on where you're going. But let's talk about some of our favorite tips and tricks. Martin?
Yeah, so there's a few different things that we can play with in order to begin to unpack complex concepts in a way that is hopefully digestible for any of your trainees. We definitely lean on metaphors quite a lot for communicating some of these complex concepts. There's some advantages to metaphors that around, just how quickly people are able to kind of internalize them. And I think it's also something that's more memorable at times, they can connect to. Also helps us to avoid, some of the really messy jargon that can often be included in security concepts. And we don't want to intimidate people by getting into that. But there's also some pitfalls here. If you choose the wrong metaphor, or say if it's not really culturally relevant to the audience, that's something that can be really alienating. Say I go into a training where nobody plays golf, and I talk about and I want to talk about golf to communicate some sort of concept, that's going to turn off a lot of the audience. So it's something to think about. Who is your audience specifically? Then also, metaphors are by nature abstract. So it would not be a metaphor if it perfectly communicated what you were trying to communicate. The abstraction is important, but it also means that if you get too abstract, now we are no longer communicating what we want to communicate. So one example that I like to use is communicating risk assessments, and I like to use the example of bikes. My hope is that by talking about a bike as a place where you're doing risk assessment all the time, we could get people to begin to internalize some of the different ways that they're already doing this work. They already have some concept of what are the things that I want to protect, and then how do I go about protecting them? And the likelihood of that happening can vary by context. Say, if you only lock part of the bike, the part that's really easy to take off, say like your wheel, that's something that necessarily makes your bike more vulnerable. Or if you go into a rougher location, then it might make it more likely that your bike's going to get stolen. So these are things that we're starting to game out. I think that we game out all the time, and something like a metaphor like a bike, I think, is a really helpful way to begin to internalize that.
I can jump in for this one, and then pass it over to David to give us one of these case studies. I really like to use case studies to supplement trainings, and this can look like a number of different ways. I feel like I've said that phrase many times, which is very indicative of our training style. We can be pulling in, current events. We can be pulling in reporting. We've already done that in earlier in this session, as well as research, which is also something that we pulled in already at this point. So, here are some of the merits of using a case study to contextualize, some digital security truism or foundation. A good case study can serve as a very good motivator, especially for trainees, and David's going to show us one, taking the example of a group of trainees who are, not super motivated to, let's say, change all of their password, all of their credentials that are tied up in password 123 to something that's unique and robust and long. So using a good case study can actually kind of light the fire and take something, take a concept that is that maybe trainees know to be true, but don't really want to run with after the session, into something that they're going to implement like today. We also use this not to like overwhelm trainees, but especially trying to take like a trauma-informed approach to some of the communities that we may work with. We want to use case studies that can make folks feel related to, that can feel like, okay, I know that this particular facilitator is like listening to my needs and the kind of unique risk assessment or threat model of the community that I'm a part of, and is really going to help, based off of this case study. I know that the recommendations that they're giving as a result are ones that are going to directly impact the threats that I'm most concerned about. So these are some of the merits of using a case study. Of course, as with any sort of like educational device, it's not always going to resonate the same with, you're not going to be working with a homogenous group. So it's not going to resonate the same with every person in the room, or like with any person in the room. Sometimes you miscalculate. As a trainer, you need to be really careful about giving any caveats that you might need to around risk assessment and the applicability of a particular case study to the lived experience of the group that you're working with. So you need to bring in risk assessment when bringing up a case study, saying like, okay, this happened, here's the news clip, here's what the fallout was, and here's what I would recommend, and say like, this is something that happened, but here are the sort of limitations to that in, as it relates to your own reality. So here's one motivating case study that we've used in the past. David, if you want to jump in.
Sure. Next slide. Oh yeah. So this is a few years old, this story, but it's basically about people breaking into Ring cameras because back in the day they didn't have 2FA enabled by default. And in this case, there were some tools built to specifically try to tackle hijacking Ring accounts. And so you see, this kind of story sort of illustrated like, what is the worst case scenario that can happen, which is kind of the thing that sometimes you want to be very specific in illustrating, just because when you talk about like people getting hacked, it's not, people may end up having kind of a defeatist mindset to that as sort of like a psychological defense mechanism to justify why they haven't done anything about it. To say like basically, oh, well, I'm going to get hacked, whatever. But then it's like, this is a real world example of something that could happen to your kids. And in terms of this, like in this case, this attacker is sort of like hijacking a Ring camera and being really spooky. And saying they're Santa Claus. So that, that's kind of something to bring home. It's just like, there's more to it than just like somebody got into my bank account, which is sort of the first example people envision when we talk about password security. But there's a lot of other things too. One of the other analogies that I use is some that are more newsroom specific. For example, hacks that have been done on news outlets where their Facebook page has been hijacked and then had fake news posted and like use that to sort of discredit the reputation. And reputation is like gold in terms of like what you do as a journalist. So so in this case, we have some sort of like things are like, you can see now that these advices that we're giving you on password managers, two-factor authentication, are very relevant to this kind of protecting you against this kind of attack. Yep. And yeah, it's a good idea to have a few different stories available to you. Some of these are a little bit more abstract than others. one of the things that I've been mentioning recently is this sort of advanced phishing attack against Twilio and DigitalOcean and Cloudflare, which I recently discovered nobody's actually read that story except FPF, it seems. So maybe don't use that one, but yeah, there's other things. There's internal research studies. Google did one that talked about the efficacy of different forms of two-factor authentication. I like bringing that one up to illustrate the efficacy of security keys.
Okay, I'll talk about my absolute favorite, which is the human-centered design activity hack. I actually don't have any kind of background in human-centered design. This is actually, if we can go to the next slide, you'll see kind of what it looks like. But these are methodologies that are created for people who work in product design. So if you're going to build a better mousetrap, so to speak, or rather literally, if you were going to do that, you would probably use tools like these in order to get people's creativity flowing to a point where they can go from ideas through a channel of chain together exercises with the ultimate goal of bringing about an actionable item, whether that is a prototype or something like that. And that's how it works in the design world. However, when I learned about this as part of a fellowship that I was on, shout out to the Luma Institute, it definitely did get my gears turning about how I might take a lot of these activities and bring them into security, digital security training. So what we have been doing is we have been taking these really awesome human design exercises and kind of tweaking them a little bit to allow people to think through digital security challenges that they face in creative ways. And so not only are these things really, really fun, like they're fun. And one thing that you'll notice as a trainer is perhaps people are really excited about doing digital security training. However, chances are they are not. Chances are they really like it's scary. It's taking time out of their day. Who are these people? Why should I trust them? So there's a lot that you do have to get over. And these are perfect activities designed to help break the ice, to get people thinking more creatively, and that releases certain hormones or whatever that makes them trust you more or whatever. I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I'm sure that's a thing. But also the most important bit about it is that for a trainer, it actually allows or gives me a framework to make the people that I'm training do the work that that I could do, but less effectively. What I mean is that these are exercises that are designed to, lead you towards a certain amount of output. And that's usually tangible output, whether it's a list, whether it's a drawing, a diagram, a bunch of Post-its all over the wall. At any rate, it's output, and it's creative output that everybody collaborates upon in order to contribute to, like the data that we have as trainers that we then use to better inform the training to train you better. So this is like an excellent hack, and I'm always really excited about it. It takes a lot of preparation. Even though I say like you're making people do the work for you, you are front loading your effort in preparing these exercises. So definitely make sure that you have all the Post-its, you have the, Google image thing up or whatever, you want to work on. And you've run through those exercises and know how they should go, and also what prompts you should be asking people to do. Think about the timing of any of these exercises that you need to stick towards, and yeah, know what you're doing and going in, so prepare. And also in the COVID era, this has been kind of challenging because during lockdown, I was still trying to do a lot of these exercises, but I couldn't just drop into your office with a bunch of Post-it notes and Sharpies. And so we had to kind of be creative with, online tools in order to get the same output and to inspire the same spirit of collaboration. So yeah, Olivia, do you want to talk through one of our COVID hacks?
Yeah, I also, it's not as legible as I'd like it to be. I tried to bump up the font size here, but so there's a bit of spillover, so excuse that. But this is this is an example of an exercise that I've run with I think nearly all of my colleagues here. This is something that we've done, with, actual like analog Post-it notes and, a big piece of paper in the past. And then we tried to devise a really effective way to translate this to, a remote learning audience. So, here we have our digital Post-its and our digital bullseye map. And so, the purpose of this activity is really as a way to introduce some of the feelings around, the types of conversations that we have that are quite sensitive. This is an activity that we typically do before we even introduce end-to-end encryption as a concept, because we want to use that sense that we develop and that we cultivate in this training activity around sensitive communications and tie that directly to, okay, this is when I have this sense, I'm going to, now that I know what end-to-end encryption is, and I know the different end-to-end encrypted tools and some of their trade-offs, I have a better idea of how to make an informed decision about the right communication tool to use with this particular person or this particular group of people moving forward. And so this is one that we really like to run if we have a lot of time, which unfortunately, I wish I always had more time with trainees, but this is just one such example of sort of using the human design human-centered approach, taking it from something that was analog and making it work over, a video conferencing platform.
Okay. And now we're going to get to the tail end of it. So you've done this training, right? But for the most part, when an organization calls Freedom of the Press Foundation or any of these other great orgs that do the same type of work, it's part of a larger trajectory within that organization. Probably they have received grant funding to include training as part of a larger, something on their roadmap that includes literally making changes within an organization about their security posture. It also includes, like bringing in new equipment or like researching new software, working that into an environment, or includes crafting new protocols on the more managerial level about how, you can, as an organization, support what people have learned after they've done a training. And we always go into and come out of every training engagement knowing that we are not just there to just drop in and go home, but we're actually a large part of a bigger project, and it's our duty to help that organization succeed as much as they need us to help with exactly that. So the training cycle includes implementation and assessment. And let's talk about exactly like what gets surfaced in a training. So I'll preface this by saying that sometimes we do this need finding like before we even go into a training, so we already do know exactly like what type of threats are already facing an organization and can address that. However, we never usually, like, if we are required to make recommendations and help with the implementation process as part of a larger program, we actually find out a lot more that we can add just by talking to people and understanding exactly what their security posture is through training. So if we are in the position to do so and are asked to, we definitely do walk organizations we work with through 3 different types of severity levels that correspond to things that they must fix depending on the resources that they have available. For those of you in the audience right now who are used to doing this type of threat modeling, within software projects, for instance, that you work on, and this is just like a new spin on it, you'd probably be familiar with a lot of these terms. So moderate severity, right, can expose sensitive organization data if exploited, and the vulnerability should be addressed in the near term. And from a software perspective, we borrow a lot of this methodology from what we've learned in building software now that we're trainers. But from a software perspective, like you probably have a good handle on what that means. But from an organizational perspective, this actually could be issues like, we're noticing there's a lot of shadow IT, meaning that people are taking things into their own hands and they're, installing, we can tell from this conversation that people are installing unsafe browser extensions in Google Chrome, and that poses, a certain risk of getting their accounts taken over or something, or I don't know, like exposure of data to a third-party service that you didn't these are the ways that we translate these properties. So then moderate, right? But then it gets even more severe. You have something high, where high severity exposure means that there's perhaps reputational harm or damage to technologies and or equipment. And this also is when you start to have the conversation about how much time, money, and skill, how much resources it'll take to put a fix on the roadmap. And then obviously there is critical, which is pretty much like the same as far as impact goes, but it is so glaringly apparent and needing to be fixed that no matter what your resources picture looks like, it definitely behooves the organization to prioritize finding those resources and getting to work immediately. Okay, but that said, this is not a precise science. Once again, we have, I think our training methodology is unique in that we've taken a lot of things that we've learned from a variety of other sectors and saying I bet that would work in DigiSec, and then just kind of piling it in. So that said, it is not a precise science, but I feel that our team has over the year honed a lot of acumen in being able to read exactly what these threats are and what their impacts are. But that said, we can go back one more. There's one more point that I wanted to say, which is that allocation of resources is easier said than done. So once again, sometimes training is part of a broader program, and we've started to be sure to ask people right up front, even before we start to do this work, exactly what the possibility there is that based off of any recommendations that we make to them, they will be able to find and utilize the resources to implement. Because otherwise, you want to be able to properly scope a project and properly deliver outcomes that it will actually make a difference within an organization that goes way beyond training, that should end or should not end once we pack up the Post-it notes and go home. Okay, and so what are these outcomes, provided that you can work within those contours? And so the first one is simply, skill building. And quite frankly, this is where we set exactly what the training part of any engagement is going to look like, because ultimately the entire purpose of a training is to boost people's confidence in using a tool, learning a brand new skill, and also giving them a vocabulary that they can use when they have questions after the training. And this gives people more confidence to ask the questions that they need to ask so as not to get themselves into trouble down the line. So for example, when we teach people how to use this new password manager, that is a very, very healthy environment for them to come out of, because they will have all of their questions addressed. They will have seen the tool. They've, poked around with it, listened to, not only to our instruction, but also to the questions of their colleagues in the room. And yeah, that's how familiarity is built. Next is a protocol. So one of the reasons why this protocol is interesting is that in addition to working, with the trainees, we always usually do have one or two or perhaps even more stakeholders in the room. Usually it is the manager who has put together the training series and brought us in and invited us in and helped us hone exactly what we were going to do within those trainings. Because ultimately we are working with them in order to introduce new protocol that either have been created before the training or are being created as part of a program that includes a training that is designed to establish consensus around certain tasks are performed, expectations around certain support within an organization. And this is what's interesting about that, having in a training like the trainees, but also like let's say the IT manager or the CISO or whatever, is that you can see that there is like a process of negotiation where the rest of the employees who are being trained tend to buy into new protocols that are being put in place because we are there as a third party to guide the conversation along the way. So this is actually a very meta aspect of training that I tend to enjoy immensely to see that unfold. Okay, and finally, support. There are certain types of trainings that the outcomes are never usually clear. So when you take online harassment, for example, we already talked about how important it is to recognize that people's social media properties do not belong to their employer, but they belong to them. And so this is where like a protocol might not necessarily cover all of the protection that an employee needs. Ultimately, in the throes of an online attack, an employee needs support, and giving space through training to establish what a support network looks like to the rest of the group, in addition to the technical fundamentals, actually does help take a program that would just have included a training and grow it out to something sustainable and supportive for everybody involved. Okay. Finally, what do we do with all this information? We don't really have too much here, but it is important to, if you can, not all engagements are going to give you enough time and space, or perhaps you're not even being paid enough to do so, to do the follow-up assessments, but it is probable that an organization that you're training with is going to want that. So obviously there's a survey, right? That is pretty easy to put together and to send out to someone. There are like a couple of questions about confidentiality, where you're going to store that data, how you transmit, survey responses to the organization in a safe and secure manner. That's the minutia of it. But ultimately, do focus on questions that center around how empowered people feel and how confident people feel in, not necessarily using a specific tool, but just around certain concepts where certain tools are, part of the material support around that concept. And another thing that I've learned is that timing is key. Once again, it's an imprecise science, but understanding that surveys usually after a training, if given too soon after a training, usually reflect how people felt about you as a trainer, about like the vibes in the room, rather than what it is they learned and what it is they're most likely to retain. And another thing that you might want to do, just because that's usually like an easier lift, is to just work on self-empowerment by giving people homework. And you don't have to check the homework, because at that point you're probably done with this particular part of the engagement. But one thing that I like to ask them to do for homework is to make promises to themselves. I usually ask them to think of these promises within 3 larger time frames. So you learned how to use a password manager. You also learned about 2-factor authentication, and you learned about SIM jacking, and all of these things. Of all of these tools, of all of these concepts, what are the concepts, or what are the tools that you can pick up and start using and fix certain things within your entire environment by this weekend? And how about by the end of 3 months? And then next year, where is it that you want to be? And so having people like afforded the space to map out what this is going to look like over the, the conceivable future can be really, really helpful because you're keeping them accountable to retention of the stuff that they've learned. Okay, so that's a spiel. But at this point, we definitely do have a Q&A function, and we will all be there to monitor that and to kind of shepherd any discussions that you might want to open up. But yeah, but other than that, does anybody else have any reflections on, on those last two phases of the training cycle that you'd like to offer, since we have a little bit of time?
I do hate to put Martin on the spot, but I do wonder if if you can speak to kind of like the importance of focusing on sort of confidence when confidence with picking up new skills, or confidence with a particular complex topic or concept when surveying after trainees after a after like an educational intervention.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what we've done here is laid out some of the foundations for just being able to see what are some of the contours of this space. And now that you've got a sense of like, here's the contours, I think that gives people a lot more of a sense of confidence in that they are now in a place where they might have been looking into the dark before, and if they come out of this going, okay, I have some idea what's out there, even if they haven't like developed all the skills, set up all the tools, haven't like fully started to act on all of the practices that we've described, knowing what's possible, and then like having a roadmap around that, I definitely think is something that I try to communicate about, and I think it can be really helpful for folks. That said, we're always learning. Like we're in a position of, I think, a very fortunate position where we're able to continue to develop these skills, and there's always some new attacks, some new interesting technique to learn about. And I also, think of this as a mutual learning experience for everybody. So hopefully that also helps people understand it's okay. Like we're all in it together.
Yeah, and it's like, it's so true. When I have in the past produced like a post-training survey to deliver to trainees, I have made the kind of misstep of not really focusing on how well do you feel prepared to now go implement a password manager, and instead I've just sent a survey that says like, do you understand what a password manager is yet? Yes or no? and over time, I learned that I was learning, nothing or very little with those survey responses, either about, the impact that I was having on the trainees, sort of in terms of like conceptual retention, as well as, my educational style, or like the way I put together that training. Like, did that work for that particular group of people, and why or why not? It's I've turned to my colleagues, Martin, time and time again to help me sort of think through producing the right type of assessment, and we're constantly learning and iterating on it. It's no perfect science.
Yeah.
I mean, unless someone here does have the perfect science, in which case, shoot me an email, please.
Yeah. Well, I think that is it for us with 1 minute to spare. Thank you so much for joining us. Ryan, will you bring us home?
Thank you, Harla. Thank you, whole team. I appreciate that. If you guys have any follow-up questions, you can email me at membership@freedom.press, and keep an eye on your inboxes for the recording of this video, which you can watch over, as well as some upcoming events for the fall. Thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate y'all. Bye.